Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm speaking with Todd Battle, former president of the Kenosha Area Business Alliance. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Carl.
How long were you involved with the Kenosha Area Business Alliance?
I served as the president from 2004 to the end of 2022, so about nearly 20 years.
Okay. What can you tell me about the history of the Alliance?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I joined the organization in 2004. I think its roots date back quite a bit longer. There were two organizations that were merged in 1996. That was the Kenosha Area Development Corporation, which I think traced its history back to an arm of city development that probably originated sometime in the early 1980s. And then there was another division called the Kenosha Manufacturers and Employers Association, which had a much longer history in the community. Those two entities were merged in 1996 to form CABA. And then I joined the organization in 2004.
Could you tell me why the two organizations decided to merge into a single entity?
Yeah, I think, it predates me, but I think the rationale or the logic was the community had put a pretty strong emphasis on economic development. And the organization, the Kenosha Area Development Corporation, had started as more of a city function, grew to have a county-wide mission. And then I think because of such an emphasis on industrial development and business services and making the community a better place in terms of its business climate, I think it was kind of a natural to marry up to the Manufacturers and Employers Association.
And what was the mission or the goals of CABA?
Yeah, so in the time that I was there, I would say definitely the emphasis was economic development. And so a lot of people define that a lot of different ways, but I think, we took that to mean let's help grow the community's economic base, let's focus on industrial development, and really kind of the measures would then be, how are we helping the community grow its tax base? How are we helping the community attract and retain employers? And how, overall, how is the local economy performing?
Okay. Do you think the impetus for CABA was partly due to the closure of the assembly plant of Chrysler in 1988?
I would definitely say some of the deindustrialization that happened in Kenosha and a lot of other Midwestern communities where heavier industrial and heavy manufacturing had some contraction. I think in Kenosha, because of the Chrysler plant and other things that happened, it definitely put a very high priority on economic development and economic diversification. So I think that some of the tenets of CABA and the Manufacturers Association predated some of those economic contractions that happened in the 80s, but I think the prominence and the priority on development and diversification really became kind of utmost important after that.
What is your background?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Michigan and spent the early part of my career there, but prior to my time at CABA, I'd spent about 6 years working in very similar organizations in Michigan with a focus on economic development and leading community economic development efforts.
Okay, and what do you think you brought to the organization?
The person that I replaced when I joined CABA, there had been a president that had served the organization about 19 or 20 years. And I think when that person retired, I was hired to take that job. I think I probably just, I probably just brought a little bit of a different perspective. I was a little bit, I was an outsider, but, from the Midwest and familiar with Midwest values and priorities. And I think it was just an opportunity for me to lead an organization. And I think maybe what I brought to the table was maybe just a different way of looking at things, and maybe a little bit of a younger person's naivety, right? So I was willing to try and do and explore different directions for the organization and some of our efforts.
And what did you like about coming to Kenosha to be the head of CABA?
Yeah, at the time that I took the job, I was probably 27 or 28 years old. So for me, it was definitely like a really, excellent career opportunity. But, having now lived in the community for 20 plus years, Kenosha really, kind of has become my home. So, married and raised my kids here, got very involved in the community through my job. So I think, maybe during the interview process, there was just a lot to like about this community. You could see a very well organized and structured and funded economic development effort. There was heavy involvement from local political leaders and community leaders, and the business community was very supportive of the effort. So there was a lot to like about the organization. And then as you looked at the community, here was this Midwestern community with the fourth largest city in the state, the city of about 100,000 and growing. And then you were situated in a kind of a key economic corridor partway between Milwaukee and Chicago. So from a development and economic development perspective, it showed as a really good opportunity to advance, my personal career, but a really good opportunity to also have a lot of impact on a community and its development.
Okay, so in your first several years, what was going on in CABA, in the community? What were the things that were brought to the community in those early years?
Yeah, so there had been a tremendous amount of work done by local communities, CABA, WISPark, Wisconsin Energy, and others to really prioritize economic development. And there were a lot of foundational pieces in place. Lakeview Corporate Park really kind of was established in the late 1980s and had started to grow in prominence and was a very successful industrial park development and a very successful economic development effort. The business park of Kenosha was well on its way to being fully developed and was another kind of key asset that the community had. There was a lot of solid infrastructure in place, and so the table was really well set. And I think early on, stepping into that role, I just tried to understand what the community needed and where CABA could add value and how we could help in those efforts. And so I think it was just stepping into that role and trying to figure out how do we take what is really set up really well and try to take it to the next level.
What were some of those early investments that CABA played a role in that then led to further development?
Yeah, if I were pointing to some things, there were some early efforts when I was new in the role. Probably a couple years in, one of the bigger efforts that we undertook with in partnership with Pleasant Prairie and Kenosha County and other parties was assembling a fairly large tract of land, which at the time was slated to be a potential future expansion or development opportunity for Abbott Laboratories. So that was a big undertaking. In total, about 500 acres were assembled and then planned and laid out and set up to receive infrastructure. So that was kind of a bigger effort. It ultimately didn't result in an investment from Abbott, but is now turned into the Prairie Highlands Corporate Park, and so that's become kind of a pretty important development in the community. We undertook, a little bit after that, we undertook a pretty significant effort to bring some infrastructure to kind of the northwest corner of the city, out by the airport. At the time, that infrastructure and that project was really kind of centered around an opportunity to have Gordon Food Service make a pretty significant investment in Kenosha. But I think there was a lot of forethought given to bringing infrastructure and services to an area of the community that previously didn't have those, and then ultimately that laid the groundwork for the community's ability to serve a site that Amazon acquired and developed, and then post Amazon, the utilities and a boundary agreement with Paris and Summers was put in place, an intergovernmental agreement that brought utilities west of the interstate. And so that now, services a fairly large industrial corridor that includes companies like Uline and Silgan Containers and others that have, there's now, several million square feet of industrial development at that location.
Okay. Now, you mentioned how this is a cooperative, collaborative effort with CABA and different municipalities, business leaders, and maybe some industrial people. Looking at CABA's role in these things, were they kind of taking the lead in one of these or another of these? Were they kind of in the background or another? Did they just kind of maybe purchase land that would allow something to happen and let the rest of it take place? What kind of roles did CABA play?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I would say CABA a lot of times acted like kind of the front door and then air traffic control on a lot of these projects. And the role we played in a particular project really depended on the project and the needs. But oftentimes we would kind of be in a situation where certain things needed to happen in the private sector or certain things needed to happen in the public sector. And CABA kind of became this convening entity where, business and local community government kind of worked together to support development. So there were a lot of things where we just kind of became the convener and kind of helped steer a lot of these efforts.
Okay. Uline moved its headquarters to Kenosha County. When was that, and what did their building of the headquarters mean for Kenosha County development?
Yep. So, the community, probably from the, kind of late 80s on, had a pretty strong track record of economic development. Like, as I mentioned, Lakeview Corporate Park had a number of wins and was a very successful development that had kind of changed the employer base and the industrial base and the landscape of the community. And other developments, Business Park of Kenosha and others, had been very successful, and there had been a lot of new investment and growth in the community. Uline opted, I believe, is like 2008, 2009. They acquired a couple hundred acres in Pleasant Prairie and opted to plant some pretty significant roots there. They established their corporate headquarters and then built out a fairly significant campus development that now includes, multiple office buildings and multiple industrial facilities that that warehouse their goods. I think a couple things stood out there. Uline is a very prominent and recognizable company. It's very known throughout kind of industry. Their products and services are kind of a staple of modern manufacturing and industrial companies. So here's this very prominent, well-recognized company. They made a major investment in the community, and the location and kind of the prominence of that site kind of was the front door to our community from Illinois, and it was kind of the front door to the state of Wisconsin from Illinois. So in a lot of ways, it was kind of further validation that the community was a good place to do business, and it was kind of a very prominent signal to anybody trafficking up and down the I-94 corridor that this is a good place to do business companies like Uline have said so, and have said so kind of with their investment and with their, corporate location. And I think it just kind of put a little wind in the sails of our economic development efforts to have such a prominent company make such a major investment in an area where it was very visible.
A lot of these companies came from Illinois. Was this a purposeful vision or direction that CABA and economic development was going, or was it just coincidence that Illinois companies decided to just move 30 miles north?
Yeah, probably a little bit of both. I'd say, if you look around the United States, and there are a handful of industrial markets in the country that are the size and scale of what you see in the Chicagoland area. It's probably the third or fourth largest industrial market in the country. So the fact that Kenosha, sits just across the state line and 55 or 60 miles away from one of the country's largest industrial markets, it just made a lot of sense that a lot of our activity and leads and new developments would migrate here from there. I think there were also some things the communities did in terms of business climate and infrastructure and environment that were positive. And I think there were certainly some disparities in terms of policy and taxes and business climate in Illinois as compared to Wisconsin that gave us a little bit of a competitive advantage in some of these efforts.
Such as cheaper land, cheaper power?
Yeah, a little bit. In the early days, those were certainly some of the contributing factors. The Lakeview Corporate Park was really a major development that was undertaken by WisPark, which was a land holding company of Wisconsin Energy. So there was definitely an advantage there in that some of the utility services, power, gas, and those types of things were very competitively priced. In the early days, some of the land development, like Lakeview Corporate Park and the Business Park of Kenosha and others, kind of enjoyed probably a little bit of an advantageous cost structure. So certainly those were some of the contributing factors.
Okay, a lot of times people talk about incentives, or the general public wonders why incentives are necessary or what they are. So can you tell me a little bit about what kind of incentives have been used in this region, in this our area, to either attract or encourage, entice, if you will, some of these companies to come to Kenosha County?
Yep. So there are a lot of, I guess, tools in the local communities toolbox that CABA and local units of government leveraged. Over time, CABA built up a fairly significant balance sheet that included economic development financing programs, and these would be things like favorable financing and low interest loans to support industrial growth. Communities have various tools that they can use, like primarily tax increment financing is a tool that's used to pay for and subsidize infrastructure to serve industry. And then there are other economic incentives that traditionally will come from a state organization. At the time, in my early days here, that would have been the Wisconsin Department of Commerce, now known as the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. I would say a couple things on incentives, just maybe a couple editorial comments. For larger attraction efforts, incentives are often kind of table stakes or expected. They're part of the overall package, and kind of what I mean by that is when it's a larger kind of attraction project, it's typically something where there would be multiple communities or states competing to secure this investment. So incentives are things that can be used at the margins to help convince or secure an investment from a corporation. So kind of if you want to to participate and be successful in kind of economic development and in business attraction, you have to have some of those tools in your toolbox. And I think over time, Kenosha County and the area and the state could be very competitive at certain times in some of these types of projects, particularly when it was a very meaningful economic development project. I think the other thing I would say, there probably is this perception that, you will hear like economic incentives, that's corporate welfare. I would say most of the time when we were using some form of an incentive to secure a project, there was a pretty significant cost benefit analysis done at some point in that project. And I would say the return on investment from the use of those incentives over time has been very favorable to Kenosha and Southeast Wisconsin and the state of Wisconsin. Whatever tax increment financing or tax credits or subsidies might have been provided for a particular project, I would definitely argue and have a lot of evidence and support to say those incentives resulted in a pretty significant return for the community in terms of what resulted from those, in terms of growth of the tax base, growth in employment opportunities, and just kind of general positive outcomes for the community.
So in one sense, it sounds like CAVA had a loan fund.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes land would be provided as a lease, not given to the company coming in. And sometimes an incentive may be building the infrastructure so that the company can come here with everything ready to go.
Yeah, all the above. I would say communities through the use of tax increment financing and CAVA through the use of some of its financial resources. I think there was always an emphasis on let's have our table well set. So let's plan out industrial locations. Let's put the infrastructure in place. We can, in a lot of instances, use tax increment financing to recover the costs of the infrastructure, and then where needed on the margins, if we have other tools that we can use to secure an investment or a win for the community, let's use those.
Okay, now we have the beginnings, or maybe it's in a moderate level of growth, a western Kenosha County Industrial Park, which is relatively new. What were the steps and how did that become a reality?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about some of the significant growth along the I-94 corridor. That has, over time, has come to be a very well-established and recognizable market. So when that happens, that you often attract institutional investment. So I think a lot of the spade work that WisPark and other organizations did in building out Lakeview Corporate Park and making it such a success attracted follow-on investment. So now when you look up and down the I-94 corridor in Kenosha County, there are probably a dozen national real estate development companies that have made or are making pretty significant investments in that marketplace. And so as that happens, it is kind of a little bit of a proof point that this is a very viable market and a very good place to make investments. So that's kind of proven. But I think what we saw a little bit, it definitely led to price increases and the market was more in demand, so the value of real estate began to increase, and it became maybe a little bit harder on the margins for smaller and mid-sized local companies to enjoy some of the benefits they did in the early days of the business park of Kenosha and Lakeview Corporate Park, where there were very attractively priced lots and local companies could buy a 5 to 7 acre lot and build a building and own their own real estate. Because the market had become a little bit more institutional, that was maybe less of an opportunity. And I think because CABA, the mission and the focus is the entire Kenosha County area, there had been so much development in the 94 corridor. We took a look out west and said, there's a lot of opportunities in the western part of the county, and maybe not as much industrial or economic development there. Tax bases were much more residential, commercial, and retail oriented. There were very few industrial parks or business parks located too far west of I-94. So our thought process was, we have some resources, we've got some experience in encouraging industrial development. There could be an opportunity here where we could find the right site and the right opportunity and the right partner in a local unit of government and have similar success in the western end of the county. So ultimately that, through kind of a fairly long process of feasibility and, exploring those opportunities, we ultimately landed on creating a business park. At the time, it was the town of Salem, now the village of Salem Lakes, CABA, the county, and ultimately Salem or Salem Lakes partnered to build the Salem Business Park.
Okay. When was that established and how large is it?
Yeah, so the park itself, there's probably in the neighborhood of just over 80 acres of gross land. So that, that probably on the net, that probably means there are probably 8 to 10 lots that can be developed in that park. This probably got started in 2015, 2016, and then over the last, call it 7 to 8 years, the park has been has matured a bit. I think there are 5 different industrial buildings or facilities in the park, and there are probably a half a dozen companies and several hundred employees that are part of those companies that are there, and probably another 35 or 40% of the park yet to be developed.
Okay. CABA also has an education foundation, and what does that do?
Yeah, so the foundation, as I understand it, from the history, was really formed in 1996 when CABA was formed by the merger of the Kenosha Area Manufacturers and Employers Association and the Kenosha Area Development Corporation. So somewhere in that combining of the two organizations, there were some assets that the organizations that were merging and their leadership said, we want to do something to benefit the education of the community. So they established the CABA Foundation. It's a 501c3 charitable organization. It's focused on education initiatives within the Kenosha County area. So that seeded the foundation, and then over time, kind of the base of assets that the foundation has continued to grow. And then it allowed CABA to do a lot of things, whether it was providing college scholarships, supporting local education initiatives, primarily, typically focused on high schools and things that are well aligned with local youth apprenticeship programs. And then ultimately, the foundation also used some of its resources to we had purchased some real estate and renovated the real estate, and then ultimately leased it to KUSD, and that's where they operated Lakeview Technology Academy from.
Okay. Now, since 2013, there have been 13,200 jobs created, $3.2 billion in capital investment, and a total of 30 million square feet of development space. How does that look? That kind of sums up the latter part of your tenure. And then in 2023, you decided it's time to go. After all that success, why did you decide to leave CABA?
Yeah, good question. As I noted, I'd been there for about 20 years. I think over that period of time, if I kind of look back, I would would feel generally pretty good about the work and some of the accomplishments of the community and the organization during the time that I was there. And then I just think for me personally, not that I was necessarily looking for a new or different opportunity, it just felt like the time was right. I had been there for 2 decades. Oftentimes I had seen throughout my career where people in leadership positions like that can, it sometimes can become maybe a little bit complacent, or can maybe become a little bit stuck in their ways, or similar things like that. And I just felt like there had been a pretty good run of success at CABA, and the organization was in a really good position, and it was probably just time for new leadership and for me to find something else to do.
Okay, and what kind of a career did you move into?
Yeah, so I had an opportunity to join an industrial real estate development company that's headquartered in Milwaukee and has a number of investments and developments throughout southeast Wisconsin. And so it was, for me personally, it was a really good opportunity to take some of my skill sets and apply them in a new role that they matched well with. And then kind of on a personal note as well, as I mentioned earlier, Kenosha kind of had become my home, my adopted home. I'd lived here for 20 years, raised my family here, and joining the company that I did allowed me to stay in the community, not have to relocate across the country or move my family to a new area. So kind of was, for me, a great opportunity to stay in a community that I loved and wanted to be in, and then have a new career opportunity that took a lot of my skill sets and leveraged those and allowed me to be successful in a new role.
Okay, and so you left CABA, and how do you see its positioning in the future?
Yeah, there has been a number of very successful economic developments, and I think we talked a little bit about this, but I think sometimes in economic development there's such a thing as momentum, and so I think you're starting to see the impacts of that. There was a lot of work done before I ever joined CABA to position the community well. I think in the 2 decades or so that I was involved in it, we tried to leverage and build on the success that had already been there, and I kind of see it the same way now. There's a lot of momentum and there's a lot of positive attributes. The community is very well situated, and the organization is very well positioned to continue to lead on economic development issues and continue to put the community in a position to thrive economically. So I would say, I think there's a lot to like about the community and CABA, and I think it's very well positioned going forward to kind of have a similar positive impact on the community and its economic future.
Well, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.